The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, covering the small town of Frost Hollow like a pristine white blanket. It was Christmas Eve, and the streets were eerily quiet. Most families were tucked away in their warm homes, their windows glowing with festive lights. But something darker simmered beneath the town's cheerful facade, a secret buried under years of holiday tradition. Sarah, a college student visiting her hometown for the holidays, had never paid much attention to the old stories whispered by the elderly around the fireplace. Tales of the snowbound stranger seemed like harmless folklore, a ghostly figure said to wander Frost Hollow every Christmas Eve, searching for lost souls to keep him company. But that night, as she walked home from her friend's house, the air felt heavy with a peculiar kind of stillness. The sound of crunching snow beneath her boots was the only noise that accompanied her. As she passed the old church on Oak Street, she noticed a figure standing by the steps. It was a man in a long, tattered coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. He wasn't moving, just standing there like a statue. Sarah quickened her pace, the warmth of her scarf doing little to stop the chill creeping up her spine. When she glanced back, the man was gone. Her heart raced as she turned the corner to her street. She convinced herself it was her imagination or some poor soul seeking shelter from the cold. But as she approached her family's house, she noticed something strange. The lights were off, though she was sure her parents had left them on before heading to bed. The wreath on the front door was missing, replaced by a single black ribbon tied into a bow. Inside, the house was unnaturally quiet. "Mom? Dad?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. The faint smell of pine and gingerbread hung in the air, but something acrid cut through it, a faint metallic scent that made her stomach churn. Sarah climbed the stairs, her hands gripping the wooden banister. The hallway stretched ahead, darker than she remembered. As she approached her parents' bedroom, she saw the door ajar. Pushing it open, she found the room empty. The bed was untouched, and the window was wide open, letting in a biting wind that carried specks of snow. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out to see a text from her dad. "Stay at your friend's house tonight. Don't come home." Sarah's blood ran cold. The text had been sent 2 hours ago, long before she'd started walking home. Her fingers hovered over the screen to reply when she heard a faint creak behind her. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. The man from the church stood at the end of the hallway, his shadow stretching long and dark. His face was still obscured, but now she could see the glint of something sharp in his hand. A knife. He tilted his head as if studying her, then took a step forward. Sarah stumbled back, her phone slipping from her grasp. She bolted it down the stairs, her pulse hammering in her ears. The living room was pitch black except for the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights. As she reached the front door, she found it locked, though she hadn't locked it behind her. The man's footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, as if he knew she had nowhere to go. Desperate, Sarah grabbed a fire poker from the hearth and spun around. The room seemed to shift, shadows lengthening and warping in the dim light. He was gone. The silence was deafening. She strained to hear anything, a breath, a movement, but the house was still. Her chest heaved as she clutched the fire poker, her eyes darting around the room. Suddenly, the Christmas tree lights flickered. One by one, the bulbs popped, plunging the room into darkness. And then she saw it, the faint outline of the man standing just beyond the tree. He raised his hand, and in the dim glow of the last flickering bulb, she saw the knife gleam. She swung the fire poker wildly, the sharp clang of metal hitting metal echoing through the room. But when she looked again, he was gone. The front door creaked open, letting in a gust of freezing air. Without thinking, Sarah bolted out into the snow-covered street, not daring to look back. She didn't stop running until she reached her friend's house. Breathless and trembling, she pounded on the door until it flew open. Her friend, wide-eyed and confused, pulled her inside. "What happened?" Sarah tried to explain, but the words stuck in her throat. When she finally managed to tell the story, her friend's face went pale. "Sarah," she whispered, "the snowbound stranger, they say he marks the houses of the ones he chooses." It wasn't until Christmas morning, when the police arrived at her family's house, that Sarah learned the truth. Her parents were found in their bedroom, their faces frozen in terror, their bodies cold as the snow outside. The only clue left behind was the black ribbon on the front door, and Sarah knew deep down, that the stranger wasn't done with her yet. On the outskirts of a desolate mountain town, a group of 5 friends gathered at a remote cabin for their annual Christmas getaway. The snowstorm that had started earlier in the day was now a full-blown blizzard, trapping them in the isolated retreat. The cabin was rustic but cozy, its wooden walls adorned with twinkling lights and evergreen garlands. They laughed, drank spiked eggnog, and swapped ghost stories as the wind howled outside. Jake, the oldest of the group, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "All right, I've got a good one," he said. "Ever heard of the Frost Mother?" The others groaned, expecting another one of his dramatic tales, but Jake's tone was serious. "No, listen. The story goes that, years ago, a widow named Miriam lived alone up in these mountains. Her son went missing in a storm like this, right before Christmas. She searched for him for days, but never found him. Eventually, she froze to death herself. People say her spirit wanders during winter storms, looking for anyone foolish enough to be out in the cold. If she finds you, she'll whisper in your ear, begging for help. But if you answer, she drags you into the storm to join her." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but quickly laughed it off, teasing Jake for trying too hard to scare them. "Nice try, man," said Liz, the skeptic of the group. "I'll take my chances with the Frost Mother." As the night wore on, the storm intensified. The wind rattled the windows and the snow piled high against the cabin. By midnight, the power flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. They lit candles and a few lanterns, the soft glow casting long shadows across the walls. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew louder. Knock, knock, knock. "Who the hell would be out here in this storm?" asked Ryan, grabbing a flashlight. The group followed him to the door, their breath visible in the cold air seeping through the cracks. Jake hesitated. "Don't open it," he warned. "What if it's her?" Liz rolled her eyes and unlatched the door. A rush of freezing wind swept inside, extinguishing one of the candles, but no one was there, just an empty, snow-covered porch. "Probably the wind knocking something loose," Liz said, slamming the door shut. But as she turned away, the knocking resumed, louder and more insistent this time. "Knock! Knock! Knock!" Jake's face went pale. "I'm telling you, it's her." "Cut it out," Liz snapped, though her voice wavered. "This is ridiculous." Ryan opened the door again and shone his flashlight outside. The snow was falling so heavily that visibility was almost zero. But then they saw it, faint footprints leading away from the porch into the woods. "Someone was here," Ryan said, his voice tight. "We can't just leave them out there." Jake grabbed his arm. "Don't follow them. It's a trap." But Ryan shook him off, pulling on his coat and boots. "If someone's out there, they'll die in this weather." He stepped out into the storm, the others reluctantly following. The wind stung their faces as they trudged through the deep snow, following the footprints. The trail led to the edge of the woods where the trees loomed like shadowy giants. "This is insane," Liz said, her teeth chattering. "We need to go back." But before they could turn around, they heard it, a faint, mournful wail drifting through the trees. It was a woman's voice, calling for help. "Did you hear that?" Ryan asked, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. "Let's go," Jake urged. "Now." But Ryan was already moving deeper into the woods, his flashlight beam bouncing through the snow. "Hello? Are you out here?" he called. The wailing grew louder, closer, and impossibly cold. The others stumbled after Ryan, their fear mounting with each step. Suddenly, the footprints stopped. The group huddled together, their breaths coming in panicked gasps. The wailing ceased, replaced by a deadly silence. Then the whispering began. It was soft at first, almost gentle, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. A woman's voice, pleading, "Please, help me. I'm so cold, so lonely." Ryan froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Who's there?" he called. "Don't answer her!" Jake shouted, grabbing Ryan's arm. But it was too late. Ryan took a step forward, his face slack, his eyes wide with terror. He dropped the flashlight, and the beam illuminated a figure emerging from the shadows. She was pale, almost translucent, her tattered dress billowing in the wind. Her eyes were hollow, and her frostbitten lips curled into a desperate smile. "Help me," she whispered. Ryan reached out to her, his movements stiff and unnatural. The others screamed, trying to pull him back, but the figure's icy hand closed around his wrist. In an instant, the wind roared like a living thing, and Ryan was gone, swallowed by the storm. Panicked, the group stumbled back toward the cabin, the whispers following them all the way. When they finally slammed the door shut behind them, they realized the footprints leading back to the cabin weren't their own. The whisper came again, soft and cruel, right behind them. So lonely. The candle flames flickered and died, leaving them in darkness. It was Christmas Eve, and the old farmhouse at the edge of town stood silent, shrouded in a thick fog. Its windows were dark, its silhouette barely visible against the cloudy night sky. The house had been abandoned for years, but tonight, for reasons no one could understand, its lights flickered on. Tom and Emily, two teenagers with a taste for danger, had heard the rumors. They'd been dared by their friends to spend an hour inside the house, a challenge they couldn't resist. Everyone in town said the farmhouse was cursed, that a family had disappeared there decades ago, leaving behind a holiday dinner untouched on the table. No one knew what had happened, but people claimed to hear strange noises coming from the house on Christmas Eve. Probably just old pipes, Tom said as they pushed open the creaky front door. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint scent of decay. The living room was frozen in time, with faded garlands and a dusty Christmas tree still standing in the corner. An old phonograph sat on a side table, its needle poised above a warped record. Emily shivered. "This place gives me the creeps," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. Tom shrugged, pulling out his flashlight. "It's just an old house. Let's look around." They wandered through the rooms, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. The dining room was eerily pristine, the long table set with plates, glasses, and a candelabra. A layer of dust covered everything, but it was as if the family had just stepped away and never returned. "Check this out," Tom said, picking up a tarnished silver fork. "It's like The phonograph in the living room crackled to life, cutting him off. A scratchy, haunting rendition of Silent Night filled the air. Emily jumped, clutching Tom's arm. "Did you touch that?" "No," he said, his voice unsteady. "Maybe it's the wind?" "The wind doesn't turn on phonographs," Emily snapped, pulling him toward the door. But before they could leave, the dining room's chandelier flickered, and a cold breeze swept through the house. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Tom said, trying to pull the door open. It wouldn't budge. "Look," Emily whispered, pointing to the table. The dust on the plates was gone. In its place were steaming piles of food: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce. The glasses were filled with dark red wine, and the candelabra was now lit, its flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. Tom backed away, pulling Emily with him. "Let's get out of here." But as they turned, they froze. The living room wasn't empty anymore. A family of 4 sat on the couch, their faces pale and lifeless. The father, dressed in a tattered suit, held a newspaper in one hand. The mother, in a faded dress, was knitting. 2 children, a boy and a girl, sat on the floor playing with antique toys, their eyes, empty and hollow, turned toward Tom and Emily in unison. "Who are you?" Emily stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The father stood, his movements jerky and unnatural, his head tilted to the side as he stared at them. "You're just in time for dinner," he said, his voice distorted like a crackling radio. The family rose as one, their bodies moving stiffly, like marionettes on invisible strings. The mother stepped forward, her hands outstretched. "Stay with us," she said, her lips curling into a grotesque smile. "It's Christmas." Tom grabbed Emily's hand and bolted toward the stairs, their only escape route. They scrambled up, their footsteps thundering against the wooden steps. Behind them, the family followed, their footsteps impossibly slow but growing louder with every second. They reached the attic and slammed the door shut, barricading it with an old trunk. Emily fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. "What do we do?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Tom looked around, his flashlight beams sweeping across the room. The attic was filled with old furniture, boxes, and a single rocking chair that creaked as if moved by an unseen hand. A child's voice echoed softly from the shadows. "You can't leave." The door rattled violently, and the trunk slid an inch. Tom grabbed a rusty crowbar from the floor, gripping it tightly. "If they get in, I'll hold them off. You climb out the window." Emily cried, her voice breaking. The door burst open, and the family stood in the doorway, their heads tilted, their smiles stretching unnaturally wide. The father stepped forward, his shadow swallowing the room. "No one leaves," he said. "Not ever." The attic went pitch black, the flashlight flickering out. Shap, Emily screamed, and then there was silence. The next morning, the farmhouse was as quiet and dark as ever. The snow-covered road leading to it showed no signs of footsteps. Inside, the table was once again covered in dust, and the phonograph sat still. But now there were 2 new plates on the dining table, set neatly among the others, each with a name scrawled on the tarnished silver. Tom and Emily. In the tiny, snow-blanketed town of Stillwater, a single Christmas tradition was observed with rigid discipline. No one left their homes after midnight on Christmas Eve. The reason for this was whispered behind locked doors and drawn curtains, a warning about the midnight caroler. The story went that every year, just as the clock struck 12, a lone caroler dressed in Victorian winter attire would appear in the town square. His voice would rise in haunting, angelic song, echoing down the streets. Those who dared to listen for too long would find themselves drawn to the window, compelled to open it despite the chill, and then they would vanish without a trace. 17-year-old Clara didn't believe in ghosts, let alone sinister Christmas carolers. Home alone that Christmas Eve while her parents visited her sick grandmother, she laughed at the warnings from her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Grayson. "Just don't open the door if you hear singing," the woman had said, gripping Clara's wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me." "Sure, Mrs. Grayson," Clara had replied, rolling her eyes. The night was quiet, with snow gently piling on the windowsills. Clara curled up on the couch, her dog Max at her feet, scrolling through her phone. Midnight came and went, and she felt a small sense of smug satisfaction. Nothing had happened. No eerie singing, no ghostly figure outside her window. Then she heard it. A clear, melodic voice drifted through the air, singing, "God rest ye merry gentlemen." The notes were pure, sweet, but strangely hollow, as if the singer were far away, yet somehow right outside. Clara's heart quickened. The dog's ears perked up, and he began to growl softly, his fur bristling. She muted her phone and held her breath. The singing continued, growing louder, closer. Against her better judgment, she crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. There he was. A man stood in the snow, illuminated by the pale glow of a street lamp. He wore a long black coat, a top hat, and a red scarf. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He held a songbook in one gloved hand and stood perfectly still as he sang, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Clara's chest tightened as the melody wrapped around her, as though the song itself were reaching into her mind, urging her to step outside. She backed away from the window, but the urge was almost unbearable. Max barked, snapping her out of her trance. The caroler's head snapped toward the house, his eyes locking with hers through the window. His smile widened unnaturally, stretching too far across his face. He closed the songbook with a snap and began walking toward her front door. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding. Max barked wildly, pacing in front of the door. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but the screen was blank. No signal, no Wi-Fi. The singing began again, this time from directly outside her door. "Oh, tidings of comfort and joy." The voice was louder now, more insistent, and the doorknob rattled as if someone were testing it. "Go away," she shouted, her voice cracking. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. Max whimpered, his tail tucked between his legs. Clara held her breath, waiting, listening. The doorknob twisted violently, the wood creaking as though it might splinter. Clara grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and backed away toward the stairs. Suddenly, there was a knock. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. "Let me in," a voice called. It was soft, melodic, but unmistakably wrong. "I just want to sing for you." Clara bolted upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. She hid in the closet, clutching the knife, Max trembling at her side. The singing began again, drifting up from the first floor. But now there were footsteps, slow, deliberate, ascending the staircase. The door to her room creaked open. Clara held her breath, biting her lip to keep from screaming. The footsteps stopped just outside the closet. "Why don't you join the choir?" the voice whispered, impossibly close. The closet door flew open, and the last thing Clara saw was the caroler's grotesque, smiling face, inches from hers. The next morning, Mrs. Grayson peered out her window. Clara's house was eerily quiet, her footprints in the snow leading only to the front door, none leading away. That night, the town gathered in the square for their annual Christmas Day vigil. As the clock struck midnight, a new voice joined the Midnight Carolers' haunting melody, a voice that sounded eerily like Clara's. The small coastal town of Cold Haven had its own chilling Christmas legend. Every year, locals warned newcomers about the Ice Fisherman, a vengeful spirit said to haunt the frozen lake just outside town. According to the tale, the fisherman had drowned decades ago on Christmas Eve, dragged beneath the ice by something no one could explain. Since then, his ghost would emerge during the coldest nights, luring anyone who ventured too close to the lake into the icy depths. Jason and Mia, visiting from the city to stay with Jason's family for the holidays, dismissed the story as nothing more than a creepy local myth. On Christmas Eve, after dinner, they decided to take a walk despite the frigid weather. Jason's younger brother Danny tagged along, his breath fogging as he spoke excitedly about the ice fisherman. "He's real, you know," Danny said, his voice hushed. "Last year, Mr. Gardner's dog went missing near the lake, and when they found him, he was frozen solid right in the middle of the ice," Jason snorted. "Come on, Danny, it's just a story to keep kids from doing dumb stuff near the lake." But as they reached the frozen expanse, something about the scene gave even Jason pause. The moonlight reflected off the surface, illuminating the jagged cracks that spiderwebbed across the ice. The lake was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the ice shifting beneath its frozen weight. "Let's check it out," Jason said, stepping onto the ice. Mia hesitated but followed, holding tightly to his arm. Danny lingered on the shore, glancing nervously at the dark forest behind them. "Guys, we shouldn't," Danny called. "Mom's gonna kill us if she finds out." Jason waved him off. "We're not going far, just to the middle. The ice is thick." The further they ventured, the more oppressive the cold became. The wind bit at their faces, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Then Mia spotted something, a hole in the ice, perfectly round and smooth, as if it had been carved with precision. "Is that a fishing hole?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jason nodded, crouching to peer into the dark water. It was impossibly still, reflecting the faint moonlight like a black mirror. He reached out as if to touch the edge when Mia grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said. "Let's just go back." But before they could move, a low, mournful sound echoed across the lake. It was faint at first, like wind whistling through the trees, but it grew louder, forming into a melody, a song that didn't belong in this world. It was both beautiful and horrifying, pulling at something deep inside them. "What is that?" Danny whispered, stepping tentatively onto the ice to get closer. Jason turned, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." As they hurried back toward the shore, the ice beneath them groaned and cracked, the sound reverberating like thunder. Danny cried out, pointing back toward the fishing hole. A figure was emerging, rising from the black water. It was the ice fisherman. His body was bloated and pale, his skin glistening with frost. Icicles hung from his beard, and his hollow eyes glowed faintly blue in the moonlight. In one hand, he clutched a rusted fishing spear, its tip jagged and dripping with frozen water. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait as if the ice itself was guiding him. "Run!" Jason shouted, grabbing Mia's hand. Danny stumbled, but Jason yanked him to his feet. The ice fisherman raised his spear and dragged it across the ice, leaving deep gouges in his wake. His mouth opened and the haunting melody poured out, louder now, more insistent. Jason felt his legs growing heavy, his body wanting to stop, to turn back toward the song. Mia screamed, slapping him hard across the face. "Don't listen!" she shouted. They reached the shore just as the ice behind them cracked open with a deafening roar. The ice fisherman stood at the edge of the fissure, his glowing eyes fixed on them. With one final haunting note, he raised his spear and slammed it into the ice. A wave of cold air surged toward them, freezing the lake's surface solid once more. The three of them collapsed in the snow, gasping for breath. When they looked back, the ice fisherman was gone. The lake was silent again, its surface smooth and undisturbed. They never spoke of that night to anyone, but every Christmas Eve, Jason, Mia, and Danny left town before sundown, unable to shake the memory of those hollow, glowing eyes and the song that still haunted their dreams. In the quiet, snowbound village of Hollow Pine, a peculiar tradition existed. Every household hung a bell on their front door on Christmas Eve. Not a wreath, not lights, just a single silver bell. It wasn't festive. It was a warning. The townsfolk believed the bell kept the Wanderer away. The Wanderer was a legend passed down for generations. It was said that every Christmas Eve, just before midnight, a figure cloaked in shadow would move through the streets, stopping at homes. If he heard the soft jingle of a bell, he would pass by. If he didn't, he would knock. Those who opened their doors to him were never seen again. Lila, new to the village and skeptical of its superstitions, was spending Christmas Eve alone in her rented cottage. Her fiancé, Andrew, had gone to visit family, leaving her to finish unpacking. She had laughed when her neighbor offered her a bell for her door earlier that day. "You really believe in that stuff?" she'd asked. The old man had just shrugged. "It's not about belief, it's about caution. Sometimes tradition is all we have." Lila politely declined the bell, rolling her eyes as she closed the door. That night, as the snow fell heavily outside, she settled on the couch with a glass of wine and a book. The silence of the village was almost unsettling, the kind of stillness that seemed to amplify every creak of the house, every gust of wind. Around 11:45, a strange sound broke the quiet. It wasn't the wind nor the groaning of the old pipes. It was soft, rhythmic, and growing closer. Crunch, 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 footsteps. Lila frowned, setting her book down. Who would be out in the snow this late? She peered out the window, but the heavy snow obscured everything beyond the porch light's glow. The footsteps stopped. Then came the knock. It was gentle, deliberate, but it sent a chill down Lila's spine. She approached the door cautiously, her heart thudding in her chest. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. Another knock, louder this time. Against her better judgment, Lila unlocked the door and cracked it open. The freezing wind rushed in, but there was no one there, just the snow-covered porch and the darkness beyond. She shut the door quickly, bolting it this time, and leaned against it, laughing nervously at her own paranoia. But then she heard it again. Crunch! Crunch! The footsteps now circling the house. Her breath caught as she heard the faint sound of tapping on the windows, one by one, moving methodically from room to room. Lila grabbed her phone to call Andrew, but the screen wouldn't turn on. It was as if the battery had drained completely. Panicking, she searched for her keys, but they weren't where she'd left them. Her pulse quickened as the tapping turned into pounding. She ran to the bedroom, slamming the door shut and pushing the dresser in front of it. The pounding stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from somewhere inside the house, she heard a voice. It was low and rasping, barely more than a whisper. "Why didn't you hang the bell?" Lila froze, her hands trembling. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice breaking. The voice came again, closer this time. "I knocked, and you opened the door." Her scream was swallowed by the storm outside. The next morning, Lila's cottage was quiet. Her fiancé arrived to find the front door ajar, the snow piled high on the threshold. Inside, the house was undisturbed, save for one thing, a single silver bell hanging from the doorknob, swaying gently in the cold winter breeze. Lila was never found. The village had a new story to tell, a warning to anyone who might doubt the importance of tradition on Christmas Eve. The town of Ash Hollow had a unique way of celebrating Christmas. Every household decorated their trees with small hand-carved wooden angels. These angels weren't just ornaments. They were talismans, said to protect families from the Collector, a dark figure that appeared only on Christmas night. The legend claimed that the Collector searched for homes without angels on their trees. His victims were never seen again, but in their place, a new wooden angel would appear, its expression twisted in silent agony. This Christmas, Grace and her younger brother Ben were spending the holiday alone in their late grandmother's house. Their parents were away, and the siblings were left to keep the old traditions alive. Grace was tired of the town's folklore and its eerie rituals. "It's just a story to scare kids," she told Ben, tossing one of the old wooden angels into a box. "Look at this thing. It's creepy." Ben, at only 8 years old, clung tightly to one of the ornaments. "Grandma always said we have to hang them, every single one." "Well, I'm not," Grace said firmly. "This year, we're doing Christmas our way." By evening, the tree was decorated with modern ornaments, glass baubles, shimmering tinsel, and bright LED lights. The carved angels remained in the dusty box in the corner. Ben protested, but Grace brushed him off, assuring him nothing bad would happen. That night, the snow fell heavy and silent outside. Grace and Ben sat by the fire, the warm glow flickering across the room. Around 11 p.m., Ben asked if they could check on the tree one last time before bed. As they entered the living room, something felt wrong. The tree lights flickered, dimmer than before, and the shadows they cast seemed to stretch unnaturally long across the walls. "See?" Grace said, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine." But Ben was staring at the window. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Grace followed his gaze. At first, she thought it was just the reflection of the tree lights on the frosted glass. Then she realized the figure outside wasn't a reflection at all. A tall, gaunt man stood in the snow, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and scarf. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He just watched. "Probably a prank," Grace muttered, though her voice wavered. She pulled the curtains shut. "Let's go to bed." But Ben wasn't moving. "We forgot the angels," he said, clutching her arm. "We need to hang them. Now." Grace's stomach churned, but she shook her head. "It's just a dumb story, Ben. Let's go." They turned off the lights and retreated upstairs. Grace tucked Ben into bed, promising him that everything would be fine. But she couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed the image of the figure in the snow. She finally gave in, deciding to check the tree one last time. The living room was darker than it should have been. The tree lights were off, and the fire had gone out. Grace froze as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. The box of wooden angels was overturned, its contents spilled across the floor. The ornaments weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged in a perfect circle at the base of the tree. The air turned frigid, and Grace felt a presence behind her. Slowly, she turned. The figure from outside was standing in the corner of the room, his body unnaturally still. His hat obscured his face, but his long, bony fingers reached toward her. A whisper filled the room, low and guttural. "Where are your angels?" Grace screamed, but no sound came out. She stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, but the figure didn't move toward her. Instead, he reached for the tree, his fingers brushing against the ornaments. One by one, the modern decorations turned black, crumbling into ash. In their place, new wooden angels appeared, each more grotesque than the last. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror, their eyes wide and mouths open as if caught in a silent scream. Grace backed away, her heart pounding. She ran to Ben's room, but the bed was empty. The window was open, snow blowing in. On the sill sat a single wooden angel, carved in the unmistakable likeness of her brother, his face twisted in fear. The collector was gone, but Grace knew he would return next Christmas. And this time, there would be no one left to hang the angels. In the remote mountain village of Frostmere, the locals spoke in hushed tones about the Red Feast. It was said that once every century, on Christmas Eve, a mysterious figure would descend upon the village, drawn to those who dared to celebrate. No one who encountered it survived to tell the tale. The villagers had long since abandoned Christmas trees, festive lights, and even the smallest signs of cheer. Instead, they stayed in darkness, huddled together, waiting for the cursed night to pass. Elise and her boyfriend Tom had rented a cabin in Frostmere for a romantic, secluded Christmas getaway. They'd laughed at the warnings from the old innkeeper when they arrived. "No Christmas," he'd said gravely. "No lights, no music, and no gifts." "Sure," Elise had replied, barely suppressing a grin. "Got it. No fun allowed." The first 2 days were perfect. The snow-covered mountains were breathtaking, and the cabin's fireplace made the small space warm and cozy. On Christmas Eve, Elise decided to surprise Tom with a little holiday cheer. While he was out chopping wood, she unpacked a small string of lights, a Santa figurine, and a wrapped present she'd hidden in her bag. When Tom returned, his face went pale. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low. "I thought we agreed not to do this." "Come on, Tom," Elise said, rolling her eyes. "It's just a few decorations. It's not like some monster is going to come because we lit a string of lights." Tom rubbed his temples. "The villagers believe it. Even if it's just superstition, maybe we shouldn't mess with it." But Elise refused to take them down. That night, they made dinner and exchanged small gifts by the fire. Despite Tom's unease, the evening passed without incident. They went to bed early, the string of lights casting a soft glow over the darkened cabin. At midnight, Elise woke with a start. The room was unnaturally cold, her breath visible in the air. The fire had gone out, and the lights on the tree flickered faintly. From outside came the sound of crunching snow, slow, deliberate footsteps. She shook Tom awake. "Someone's outside," she whispered. Tom grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the window. He froze, his hand tightening on the curtain. "Elise, turn off the lights. Now." "What? Why?" she asked, her voice rising. Before he could answer, a heavy knock echoed through the cabin. It wasn't the knock of a person. It was impossibly loud, rattling the walls. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural breathing. "Elise," Tom hissed, "turn off the lights." She scrambled to unplug the string of lights, plunging the cabin into darkness. The breathing grew louder, closer, as if the thing outside was right on the other side of the door. "Who's there?" Tom called, his voice shaking. A voice answered, deep and hollow. "You celebrated. You invited me." The doorknob began to twist, the metal groaning under the pressure. Tom shoved the couch in front of the door, motioning for Elise to hide. She crawled under the bed, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. The door burst open, the cabin filling with a blast of icy air. The thing stepped inside, its footsteps heavy and wet, leaving streaks of dark red in the snow it tracked in. Elise held her breath, peeking out just enough to see its legs, long, twisted, and clawed, like a grotesque mockery of human form. Tom stood his ground, wielding the flashlight like a weapon. "Leave us alone," he shouted. The creature laughed, a sound that sent chills down Elise's spine. "You lit the lights. You celebrated. You are mine." The flashlight flickered and died as the creature lunged. Tom's scream was cut short, replaced by the sound of flesh tearing and bones snapping. Elise clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming, tears streaming down her face. The creature sniffed the air as though searching for something. Its voice rumbled again. "One remains." Elise felt the bed creak as the weight of the creature pressed against it. She closed her eyes, praying it wouldn't find her. Moments stretched into eternity, but finally the creature growled and left the cabin, dragging Tom's body into the snow. Elise waited until dawn to emerge, her body stiff and frozen with fear. The cabin was in ruins, the floor stained with blood. Outside there was no sign of Tom, only deep claw marks in the snow and the faint, distant sound of laughter. The villagers found Elise wandering the woods hours later, her hands wrapped tightly around the string of Christmas lights. She never spoke again, but her wide, haunted eyes told them everything they needed to know. The Red Feast was real, and the warning was no mere superstition. The small town of Everpine had a peculiar holiday tradition that no one dared question. Every Christmas Eve, each household placed a bowl of milk and cookies outside their front door. Not for Santa, but for the Watcher. The Watcher, according to local legend, roamed the town during the hours of darkness, inspecting each offering. If the cookies were fresh and the milk unspoiled, he would pass by silently. If not, the consequences were said to be horrifying. The Watcher didn't simply take from the unworthy, he took them. This year, Clara and her family were spending their first Christmas in Everpine. Having moved from the city just weeks earlier, she hadn't thought much of the townsfolk's insistence on the tradition. It seemed like a quaint, quirky story meant to entertain kids. As she unpacked boxes in the kitchen, her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Reed, came by with a plate of freshly baked cookies. "These are for tonight," Mrs. Reed said, her voice trembling slightly. "Place them outside with a bowl of milk before midnight." Clara smiled politely, but inside, she rolled her eyes. "Thanks, but I think we'll be okay without them." Mrs. Reed's face darkened. "Don't ignore this, Clara. Everyone in this town follows the tradition. Everyone. No exceptions." That night, Clara's husband Mark laughed when she told him about the cookies. "What's the worst that could happen?" he joked, but Clara couldn't shake Mrs. Reed's serious tone. At 11:30, she decided to humor the old woman. She poured a glass of milk and set out some store-bought cookies from the pantry. "There. Satisfied?" she muttered to herself. Midnight came and went without incident, and Clara felt a wave of relief. She even laughed at her earlier nervousness. As the family drifted off to sleep, the snow began falling heavily outside, blanketing the quiet town. At 3 a.m., Clara woke to a sound, faint but distinct. A soft tap, tap, tap against the living room window. At first, she thought it was the wind or a branch scraping against the glass, but the sound was too deliberate. She crept downstairs, heart pounding, and peeked through the curtains. Nothing. Just the snow-covered yard and the faint glow of the street lamp. Relieved, she started to turn away when she noticed something peculiar. The plate of cookies and the bowl of milk were gone. Not empty. Gone. The porch was swept clean as if they'd never been there. A chill ran down her spine. She checked the front door lock, reassured herself it was secure, and went back to bed. At 4 a.m., the sound came again. This time, it was louder. A slow, deliberate knock on the front door. Clara shook Mark awake, her voice trembling. "Someone's at the door." Mark groggily grabbed a baseball bat and trudged downstairs, muttering about pranksters. Clara followed at a distance, scurrier, her stomach knotted with dread. When Mark opened the door, there was no one there, only footprints in the snow, leading away from the house. But these weren't ordinary footprints. They were impossibly large, with claw-like impressions, as if something monstrous had walked through their yard. Mark shut the door quickly, locking it again. "Probably some kid trying to scare us," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. The next morning, Clara went to check on Mrs. Reed to share the strange events of the night, but when she knocked on the neighbor's door, no one answered. She peered through the frosted window and saw the house in disarray, furniture overturned, curtains shredded. The plate and bowl Mrs. Reed had set out were untouched on her porch, the milk frozen solid. The police searched the house but found no sign of Mrs. Reed. They declared her missing, and though the locals whispered that the watcher had taken her. Clara and Mark packed their bags and left Everpine before nightfall, unable to shake the feeling they were being watched. When they finally settled in their new home miles away, Clara found a single cookie sitting on their kitchen counter, crumbling and stale, with a bite missing. In the snow-laden town of Greystone Hollow, Christmas came with an unspoken rule: never leave your curtains open after dark. The locals believed that on Christmas Eve, an entity known as the Gift Bearer roamed the streets. Unlike Santa Claus, the Gift Bearer didn't bring joy, it brought despair. The stories varied, but the warning was always the same. If it sees you through your window, it will leave you a gift. You must not open it. If you do, something will be taken from you, something far worse than your life. Daniel had heard the tale from the real estate agent when he moved into the Hollow just 2 weeks before Christmas. He'd shrugged it off as quaint folklore meant to keep children in line. He wasn't from here, and he didn't believe in silly traditions. On Christmas Eve, snow fell heavily outside his quaint rental home. Daniel sipped his whiskey by the fire, admiring the glimmering lights of the Christmas tree. He had opted for a quiet holiday, one away from family and the chaos of the city. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind against the windows. Around 10 p.m., Daniel glanced at the uncovered window beside his tree. He could see the snow piling up and the shadowy outlines of neighboring houses. The stories drifted back into his mind. With a smirk, he raised his glass in mock salute to the empty street. "Here's to the gift bearer," he joked, his words lost in the crackle of the fire. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Daniel began to feel uneasy. The wind seemed to shift, carrying a faint, high-pitched hum. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the sound grew louder. It was rhythmic and unnatural, like a child humming a Christmas tune off-key. Curiosity tugged at him, and he moved toward the window, peering out into the snowy darkness. He saw nothing but the empty street. Yet the humming persisted, now so close it felt as if it were inside the house. And then he saw it. A figure stood on the street, barely visible in the dim light of a distant lamppost. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, thin limbs and a hunched posture, its head tilted at an odd angle, as if it were studying something with intense curiosity. It clutched a small box in its spindly fingers, wrapped in blood-red paper with a black ribbon. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He ducked away from the window, his heart pounding. "It can't see me," he thought. But his stomach dropped as he realized he hadn't turned off the Christmas tree lights. The window was like a beacon in the dark. The humming stopped. He dared to peek again. The figure was gone. A sharp knock at the door made him jump. It wasn't the kind of knock one might expect from a visitor. It was slow and deliberate, each strike echoing through the silent house. Daniel froze. His instincts screamed at him not to answer, but he couldn't stop himself from creeping toward the door. Through the peephole, he saw nothing, only the faint outline of something resting on the porch. He opened the door just a crack, the cold air biting at his skin. There it was, a box wrapped in crimson paper, tied with a black ribbon. The stories flashed through his mind. If it leaves you a gift, do not open it. Daniel slammed the door and locked it. He paced the room, his mind racing. What if it was just a prank? What if it wasn't? The box sat on his porch, untouched. He stared at it through the peephole for what felt like hours. Finally, he decided he couldn't leave it there. He opened the door just wide enough to grab the box and brought it inside. It was heavier than it looked. The ribbon was tied so tightly it seemed to pulse beneath his fingers. He placed it on the coffee table and sat down, staring at it as though it might move on its own. He told himself he wouldn't open it, but as the minutes dragged on, curiosity gnawed at him. Surely there was no harm in taking a peek. Just one peek. With trembling hands, he untied the ribbon and tore away the paper. Inside was an old, ornate music box, its surface etched with strange symbols. He hesitated before lifting the lid. The melody it played was haunting and unfamiliar, notes that didn't seem to belong together. The room grew colder, the fire sputtering out as if snuffed by an unseen force. The shadows in the corners of the room lengthened, twisting and writhing like living things. Daniel tried to close the box, but it wouldn't budge. The melody grew louder, reverberating in his skull. And then, from the darkness, came a whisper. "A gift for a gift. What will you give me?" The shadows surged forward, enveloping Daniel. His screams echoed through the empty house, but by the time morning came, the place was silent. The neighbors found the house undisturbed, save for one thing, a red-wrapped box sitting on the doorstep. Inside was Daniel's watch, still ticking, his name engraved on the back. No one in Greystone Hollow left their curtains open that night, or ever again.